Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis with Forbes Breaking News. Joining me now is Congressman Jim Himes. Congressman, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
We have a wide range of topics to cover today, so let's dive right into it. First up, there is a new House Speaker, Mike Johnson. What are your thoughts?
Well, first of all, I'm just so delighted that we are not in the chaos that we were in for weeks without a speaker. You know, you can't do a thing without a speaker. We can't pass anything. And of course, with everything that's happening in Israel and Gaza and Ukraine and the fact that we need to get a budget solved, I'm glad that we have a speaker. Now, I'm not glad that the speaker is ideologically where the speaker is. This is probably the most right-wing speaker the House of Representatives has ever had. Needless to say, he's not where I am on a whole bunch of issues. But as I said, I'm just glad we're back in business and we can, get about the business of legislating and hopefully doing some good things for our constituents.
Let's dive a little bit deeper. Earlier this week, Speaker Johnson said he's going to, quote, move a standalone Israel funding bill and will separate the funding from Ukraine aid. I know on your Twitter, right next to the American flag, you have a Ukraine flag. So what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I'm very disturbed with where the new speaker has decided to go on Israel aid. He's moving just Israel aid with no humanitarian aid and without the package of aid for Ukraine. That's bad for at least two reasons. Number one, Israel aid has always had very strong bipartisan support here in the House of Representatives, and it's urgent. We know that because we saw the brutality that Israel suffered on October 7th. It's urgent, and what the speaker has done is said, well, I'm only going to pass this Israel aid, first of all, without the Ukraine aid, which is essential to Ukraine's ability to fight off Russia. Oh, and by the way, we're going to only pass it if you also agree to reverse one of your priorities, which was to provide the resources that the IRS needs to go after tax cheats. And so for the first time ever, a Speaker of the House is saying, well, we're going to use Israel aid as a political tool to, first of all, create a partisan issue, and secondly, to try to reverse a Democratic priority. If you open that door in the future, Israel aid and other critical emergency aids, and it's not just national aid, right? It's things like Hurricane Sandy, Hurricane Irene. Then now all of a sudden we're in a world where, yeah, we'll pass hurricane relief, but only if you agree to this policy rider. That's a terrible place to be.
Do you think right now the GOP is acting like Israel aid is more crucial than Ukraine aid? And do you agree with that, or do you think both are equally important?
Well, it's not that they're acting that way. That's what they believe, right? I think the Republicans are probably unanimous in saying that they would like to see an Israeli aid package passed, close to unanimous, whereas half of them don't think that we need to provide any aid to Ukraine. So it's not a question of urgency. It's the fact that what we used to think of as the party of Reagan, the man who stood up strong against the Soviet Union, has decided that, well, gosh, the Russians invading Ukraine, not our problem. Now, we could spend an awful lot of time on whether it is our problem and when it does become our problem, but it is actually pretty mind-blowing that the party of Reagan has decided that Russian invasion of Ukraine, not our problem. And so, what you said, is that what they believe? It's very clearly what they believe in terms of, where they're putting their effort and their energies.
If the GOP holds fast that Ukraine aid must not be tied to the budget or Israel aid, is there any way you would support a budget without Ukraine aid, rather?
Well, let's be clear about what they're saying about Ukraine aid. They're not linking it to the budget. It would be done separately under a supplemental piece of legislation. What they're saying, and again, this is back to the question of whether we should use this stuff as a bargaining chip, whether we should require concessions from the other side on something that I regard is as essential as aid to Ukraine when they're, under threat, when they're in a war. And what they're saying on Ukraine is, well, we'll pass Ukraine, but only if you agree with what we want to do on the U.S. border. So what they're doing is they're saying, unless we get what we want on the U.S. border, and by the way, I'm all for conversations about the U.S. border. I think we can do an awful lot more on the U.S. border. But what they're saying is we're only going to pass Ukraine aid if we fix, according to how we think it should be fixed, the U.S. border. And so, let me paint a picture for you of where this goes. There will be essential emergency stuff, every couple of months that the Congress has to handle. And when we have a Democratic majority, how are the Republicans going to feel if, we say, well, Israel aid, well, you guys got what you wanted on the IRS. Well, guess what? We want the Green New Deal in order to pass Israel aid. That is just not a path that this Congress should go down. And sadly, that's the path the Republicans are taking us down.
I do now want to switch gears a little bit and talk more about Israel. What do you make of the Biden administration's response to the situation unfolding in the Middle East right now?
Look, I think the Biden administration has been superb on this issue. And what I mean by that is that they have done what I would hope that they would do, which is stand very strong with Israel, especially at a moment when Israel suffered a horrible terrorist attack. I mean, an unimaginable. And if you've seen the pictures of, raped women, murdered, elderly senior citizens, babies burned, it's almost inconceivable what the tragedy was that was perpetrated upon them by Hamas. So he stood strong with Israel, but I will tell you, as somebody who spends an awful lot of time on our national security, he, the National Security Advisor, the Secretary of State, have said over and over and over to the Israelis and every day that, look, you are totally justified defending yourself and going after this group that did this historical crime against you, but you have to do it observing the laws of armed conflict, protecting civilians, and in such a way that the millions of people in Gaza who have nothing to do with Hamas are not put unnecessarily in harm's way. So I think the president has been exactly right. He said exactly what we need to do, which is that we will never, ever tolerate the kind of terrorist attack that Israel experienced. But that doesn't mean that it's okay to violate the humanitarian values that are so important for the civilians of Gaza.
Not many, but some in your party have called for a ceasefire. Former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton said that those calling for a ceasefire simply don't understand Hamas. What do you make of calls for a ceasefire?
Well, I disagree with those calls for this reason. And I don't know whether the people who are calling for a ceasefire don't understand Hamas. I think it's pretty hard not to understand Hamas given what they did. I don't like using the word, but it's hard to see them as anything other than pure, unadulterated evil. I think it's more people reacting to the Israeli military operations in a very tight space in Gaza, right? And of course, your heart breaks at the humanitarian tragedy. How can it not? But what I would say, and I've said this to any number of people who've asked me to support a ceasefire, is so if the Israelis just stand down, and the hundreds of people who planned and undertook this murderous terrorist attack, what about them? Are we just going to say there's no justice that you need to face? So for somebody to convince me that a ceasefire is a good idea, you need to explain to me how a ceasefire brings the perpetrators of this historical terrorist brutal attack to justice. And you also need to explain to me, look, I know exactly what Hamas would do. I'm on the Intelligence Committee. If they were offered a ceasefire, that morning, they would begin the process of importing the arms, of planning the next operation to murder Israelis. And by the way, don't take it from me. They've said they would do that. So I do think that even though we need to be absolutely focused, as the president is, on humanitarian issues and on the Israeli military doing this in a way consistent with the laws of armed conflict, calls for a ceasefire in the face of that injustice and that brutality and what Hamas would do, I think, are misplaced.
Congressman, to close this out, I want to ask you about some votes that you made. You called them unpopular yourself on X, and I want you to explain that a bit. The first one is you voted against censuring your colleague, Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib. Can you walk us through why?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I feel no regret about this at all. So last night we were supposed to have two votes, one to censure Rashida Tlaib, who the Republicans don't like, and one to censure Marjorie Taylor Greene, who the Democrats don't like. And here's the thing. If we start getting into the business of censuring members of Congress because we don't like what they say, and those censure resolutions were about what Rashida Tlaib said and about what Marjorie Taylor Greene said, we are in a world of pain. I mean, in this country, we believe in free expression. And the right answer to ideas that you deeply disagree with, and by the way, I deeply disagree with lots of things that Marjorie Taylor Greene and Rashida Tlaib say, is not to stop their speech or to sanction their speech. It's to reply why you think they're wrong. So anyway, the idea of censuring somebody for their expression, for their ideas, is a profoundly un-American idea.
Do you consider what either Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene said or what Rashida Tlaib said anti-Semitic or bigoted?
I don't want to start pulling apart, there's all this talk about Marjorie Taylor Greene going after George Soros for Jewish space lasers. And, I was really annoyed that Rashida Tlaib kept up a news article on her Twitter feed that said that Israel had bombed the hospital when it turned out that that wasn't the case. I will tell you this. There are plenty of examples of what I would call irresponsible rhetoric, quite frankly, and maybe this is my partisan glasses, but just spend a little time on Marjorie Taylor Greene's Twitter feed. it is a flaming garbage dump. And I'm sure there are those who would say that about Rashida Tlaib. My point is, and I don't want to get into sort of looking at individual tweets and deciding this one's anti-Semitic, this one's not. My point is that in this country, our very First Amendment to our Constitution is that people have, that the government will not control what people say. And if the government itself starts saying, I'm sorry, you can't say that, we are very much at odds with the founding principle of this country's democracy and, quite frankly, of any liberal democracy.
Congressman, you also broke away from the majority of your party and voted against the expulsion of Congressman George Santos. He's widely embattled, and both members of both parties have criticized him. Can you walk us through that decision?
Yeah, there's not much to walk through. Look, people tell me in this country, and I believe that in this country, one of our core principles is that you are innocent until proven guilty. The House Ethics Committee has not finished its work. It hasn't finished its adjudication of whether he's guilty of something or not, and the courts have not finished their adjudication. So again, if you are innocent until proven guilty, and he has not been proven guilty, the logic here is not hard. And I don't want that bright line to fade from us, because I've spent a fair amount of time here in the House of Representatives. I will tell you that if we don't abide by the principle of you are innocent until proven guilty, tomorrow there will be another member that annoys the majority of the House, or there will be some member on the Democratic side of the Republican, and we will spend our time kicking each other out of Congress. So for me, I'm falling back on that principle that we claim to be important in this country, which is that you are innocent until proven guilty.
Final question. You said this, quote, I voted no on a resolution declaring a nuclear Iran unacceptable. I've always worked against nuclear Iran. So can you explain this vote?
Yeah, absolutely. Again, not a hard one. If you read that resolution, and I agree with almost every word in that resolution, a nuclear Iran is inconceivable, and we need to do everything we can to avoid that. But there was a line in that resolution that said, we will stop Iran from getting a nuclear weapon by all and any means necessary. That means war. And if I ever have to vote, and I had to take a vote once when President Obama was asking for permission to undertake surgical strikes, missile strikes in Syria, if I ever have to take a vote on whether or not to go to war with Iran, I am going to look at the facts. I'm going to talk to my constituents over and over and over again. We are talking about the most serious decision a member of Congress can make. And I'm not going to have somebody say, well, look at this resolution that you agreed to 3 years ago where you said by any and all means necessary. So again, I think that the decision to go to war is the most serious one that the Congress of the United States can make. And I'm not predetermining my vote on something so serious.
This comes at a time when there are reports that Iranian officials were involved in helping Hamas plan the October 7th attack against Israel. And there are fears that a broader Middle East war could spread. So how else then do you plan on working against nuclear Iran?
Well, to date, the United States does not know and does not believe that Iran was directly involved in the attacks by Hamas on Israel on October 7th. Now, you could say that that's a semantic point, and it probably is, because, of course, Iran has armed Hamas for years and years and years. So their hands are far from clean. But again, when you're talking about war and peace in the Middle East, it's pretty important to be pretty precise about what you say and how you say it, because it is a tinderbox. So, and that, by the way, is separate from a nuclear Iran. I was a supporter of the Iran nuclear deal. And in the couple of years that the Iranian nuclear deal was in place, those were the only couple of years in which Iran absolutely stopped its progress towards building a nuclear device. President Trump got us out of that deal. Guess what? Iran is back in the business of accumulating the uranium and doing what they need to do. So, we need to be very careful about what we say right now, because we need Iran to stay out of this fight in between Israel and Gaza. We need their proxies to stay out of this fight. I'm talking about Hezbollah and groups in the West Bank, etc. Even as we work to make sure that Iran does not get a nuclear weapon. Now, lots of people didn't like that Iran nuclear deal, but they didn't have an alternative at the time. And that deal actually, over a period of years, until President Trump took us out of that deal, stopped Iranian progress. I think that in that direction lies how we ultimately get Iran to stop the progress they're making towards a nuclear device.
Congressman, I really appreciate the time today. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks a lot. Take care.